Now, next this morning, with lockdown measures kind of easing, many people are, of course, going back to work. Maybe this is the first day back to work physically for a while. Parks have reopened in some cases. Schools are looking to reopen in June. Things are generally moving, in the right direction, it would seem. Although a vaccine is still needed, and many of today's front pages focus on the government's efforts to find one, it's reported that trials are going well and jabs could be available for half the UK's population by September, if all goes to plan. Other people say not till next year. Let's catch up with Dr. Duncan Robertson from Loughborough University's School of Business and Economics. Duncan, morning.
Morning, Ben.
I can't believe, honestly, it seems like 2 minutes since we last speak. We speak every Monday. Look, a couple of things to get at then. The vaccine word has come back again. We were talking about this maybe a month or so ago. Where are we with that?
Well, there are lots of vaccines around the world that are being trialled at the moment, and two promising ones. There's one in Oxford and there's one in Imperial College. And I think people are trying to ramp up the production capacity in the UK in case one of those is actually seen as viable. And so we want to be in a position, if one gets through all the trials, then we want to be able to manufacture it as quickly as possible.
Just coming up coming up with a jab. However, I mean, in some cases, can take 10 years.
Well, that's right, and I think all around the world, immunologists and scientists are really trying to make sure that all the efforts are concentrated on what's obviously the largest public health problem of kind of almost the century. So all efforts are put into it, and I think what's been useful in getting a vaccine so quickly with this one is that people have been working on similar sorts of vaccines, especially in Oxford. So they're sort of ready to change the target to COVID, where they've been working on similar ones to SARS and MERS in the past. But yeah, I think how quickly it's going to happen. I think September seems very, very optimistic. But I think what people are trying to do is, if the scientific trials get through, then you don't want to be delayed by then having to make up manufacturing capacity. So it's good to see that things are in place.
Other things, I noticed that there's some discussion over COVID transmission by age, and that's sort of ongoing science, isn't it?
Well, it is, and there's a lot, I think because it is such a novel condition, scientists are having to go and basically go back to first principles and find out everything about it. I think, one set of information that came out, a few days ago was from the Office of National Statistics, where they did a big survey of people to work out who has the virus at that time. And they said there were about 150,000 people at that time, which was a couple of weeks ago, had the virus. But what was interesting about that is they didn't really see any difference between youngsters, middle-aged people, and old people in terms of how many people have them. So that's quite interesting. So there's some debate about how many people have it at different ages, but there's also another bit of information about who transmits this virus. And that's still kind of ongoing. But all the time we're getting more and more information, and surveys are being done and testing is being done across the population, so you can get a better estimate of who has it. Because,
of course, the simple thing is that who has it and who ends up in hospital with it is kind of a different kettle of fish. Is there any age relation to those that get it really badly?
Well, absolutely. I think, right since people were monitoring it in China, several months ago, there is this very much this relationship with it between age. And simply put, the older you are, the more likely you are to end up in hospital. So that's why, it's thankfully, young children haven't been having many symptoms of these. Of course, some children do, and this is not as though there is zero effect for children, but generally, and that's why it goes back to, the criteria about vulnerable people. So, if you're in certainly your 80s or 90s, but then 70s and maybe even late 60s, it does create a higher risk for you, and that's a well-known risk, as well as being male. That's another one which isn't good for this condition. And
in fact, we're going to be talking about this in about a quarter of an hour's time. There's also issues about the BME community as well.
Yes, absolutely, and that's another fascinating thing. And there's a bit of research that's been going on about that. The chief medical officer has put in quite a lot of effort into trying to find out. I think people realise actually there is it is more risky to be part of that BME community. But I think the question is why. And so maybe there are correlations or relationships between social factors, but also I think there's also, without that, there seems to be a higher risk. Could be genetically, and people are trying to work that one out because that's a really difficult one to work out why. But the point is, if you can do research into that, you might be able to understand the virus and the effects it has, and hopefully that can be used to help.
There was a lot last week about testing again, and just talk me through the different types, because there's the people talking about an antigen test versus an antibody test. What do they test for, and how are they different?
So there are two ways that testing can happen. One is and two bits of information you can get. One is, do I have the virus at the moment? And that's particularly important if you're, considering whether you want to self-isolate, for example. And actually, I'm, part of a trial where they're trying to get a population estimate of that. So I think today there's a kit arriving as part of a research project where I can find out whether I have it at the moment. And that's obviously very useful to basically say, if I do have it, then do I go out into the community? And no is the answer. So that's one thing. That's the antigen test. And there's also an antibody test, which is to say, have I had it in the past? And that's also useful to know, particularly to work out how much it has spread through the population. So both of those are sort of, do I have it now, and have I had it in the past?
And you sort of can't talk about that without talking about the dreaded R value, which people talk about an enormous a lot. And I sort of, in my mind, I picture it almost like a pressure, needle in a pressure gauge, going up and down to. We were talking about this last week, weren't we? It needs to be below 1. Now, there's been some research to show that there are different figures, dependent on the granularity of the figures, depending on how close to the sort of local regions you get to.
Exactly. So when we talk about R, we talk about that R level in a population. And that population, if you think about, it could be the world, it could be the UK, it could be England, could be Leicester, it could be a care home in Leicester. So there are different levels of R across the smaller area you go to. You may have different levels of R, and it's very difficult to get that level of R without testing of the community. So I think that's why there's such a drive to actually work on testing, and that will allow people and scientists to understand what the R level is closer to where you are and to get better estimates. So there have been quite a lot of people trying to work this out, but they're relying on data, for example, hospital admissions or deaths, which is, quite old data. So I think, what needs to be done is there needs to be much more effort into actually testing people to see, do they have it at the moment? And then that will help a better prediction of, or better estimate of what R is. So at the moment, we're kind of looking back several weeks before lockdown was released. So we don't really know what R is at the moment.
Duncan, as ever, thank you so much for keeping us up to date with where the science lies, because it moves so much every week. It's kind of a different snapshot of what's going on. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, man.
There you are, Dr. Duncan Robertson from Loughborough University joining us here on BBC Radio Leicester.